All right, welcome to testing and developing gRPC APIs. Ian, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Ian Douglas. I'm a senior developer advocate here at Postman. And what does that mean? It means I get to go to conferences, I get to do workshops and webinars like this. I get to do a lot of public speaking, a lot of content creation, have a really good time with developer education. I've been really nerding out on gRPC this year. I was just at gRPC Conf in San Francisco last week and gave a talk out there. It was really great to meet the community and interact with the community there. And a lot of people were surprised that Postman actually got into gRPC. They're like, why is Postman at a gRPC conference? But we've actually had support now for a little while. So I've been really excited about this webinar specifically. Joyce and I did a live stream about gRPC a little while ago, and we thought this would be a good webinar to do for Intergalactic. So let's turn it over to Udit. Udit, can you introduce yourself and let us know a little bit about what you do at Postman?
Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Udit. I'm a staff engineer here at Postman. I lead the API client team, specifically the multi-protocol part of it. So for the last 2 years, we have been adding support for newer protocols into the Postman. Today we are talking about gRPC, and recently we also added support for MQTT. So all the new protocols and the existing ones is something which I usually spend most of my time with.
Yeah, you can thank Udit for the multi-protocol nature of where Postman's been headed in the last year or so. And I am Joyce. I am in developer relations as well with Ian. So I frequently give some of these webinars, occasionally give talks. gRPC is one that I have not been involved with too much. So I'm really excited to hear other people's stories about gRPC and questions. So we'll soon see how many people on the line are working with gRPC today. All right, so go ahead.
Yep. So we've got a poll. We want to get to know everybody a little bit. We'll launch that in just a sec. But from an agenda point of view, we're gonna do that poll real quick. It'll only take a moment or two, and then Joyce is going to give us a gRPC overview, go into the history of what is gRPC, how did it get started. That'll be basically on the slide deck. And then from there, I'm going to take the role of an API designer, and I'm going to show how to design out a gRPC API. And then Udit is going to take us through how to do testing and show us from a developer point of view how a developer might use Postman on the gRPC side. And then we'll share out some resources at the end, some additional things that you can do. And then if we'll reserve some time for Q&A at the end. So depending on how many questions we have related to the content, we'll do our best to answer those toward the end. So again, use that Q&A panel if you've got questions about the content as we go. Let's go from there. So on the next slide, basically, we're going to do the getting to know you a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll. So if everyone can take a moment, please, let's go through these questions. The first question is getting to know your experience level with gRPC. How familiar are you with gRPC? Have you researched it a little bit? Do you have any experience with it? Do you use it on side projects or work projects? Do you consider yourself a developer or a tester? That one's actually multiple choice because you might have multiple roles. And then the last question is, how long have you been using Postman? Are you fairly new to Postman? Have you been using it for 6 months to a year to 3 years, more than 3 years? These last two questions help inform what we do here at Intergalactic and the different kinds of workshops that we put together. So as you come and hang out with us in workshops like today, it'll give us an opportunity to kind of see where everybody's at, and then who's actually attending. Do we get more developers? Do we get more testers? We're starting to see more non-developers come in as well, which is really great. So if you can take a moment, we'll give everybody another few seconds to fill that out for us. Then we'll go over those results, and we'll share out the results with everybody. So we'll give everybody a moment. Looks like we've got about half of the audience actually no experience in gRPC. So this will be pretty exciting to kind of go through and explain kind of at what we call grassroots level, kind of like really introductory level, what is gRPC, how does it work, and show you how that workflow happens inside of Postman. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that poll here in just a minute. If anybody else wants to go ahead and answer that, and then we'll go through and give you a history on what is gRPC and how it's used. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and end that poll, and then we're going to share the results with you here. So it looks like we were right at 50%. So 50% of you, no experience with gRPC. About a third of you have researched it a little bit. Only 3% of you use it on personal projects. About 15% of you use it currently in work projects, which is great. 64% of you identify as developers, 41% as testers, 13% as DevOps, 13% as management, 8% as other. And we're pretty split around the 20 to 30% for the experience level. So about 21% of you are brand new or relatively new to Postman, 21% within 6 months to a year, 24% 1 year to 3 years, and 34% of you have been using Postman for 3 years or more. So great. So thanks for filling out that survey. I'm going to hand it back over to Joyce, and we'll continue on our content.
That's exciting. So my section is on just providing a high-level overview of gRPC and also the history, which to some might sound kind of boring, but considering 50% of you have no experience, and even the people that are working on it, 15% currently using gRPC to work on your projects, my section is more designed to provide the context of the why and why are you using gRPC? So what is it and where did it come from? So the Postman State of the API report comes out every year, and I think the last one for this year was published just a few months ago. We surveyed 40,000 respondents, and we asked them what API technologies they used. So, REST, of course, webhooks, GraphQL, SOAP, a lot of the regular protocols, but then you have gRPC only at 11%. Postman supports most of these protocols today, but gRPC has been one that I think if you're using it rather extensively at work, but then a lot of people are curious about it. So let's take a look at the history of web APIs. So this is a refreshed infographic from Bruno Pedro, an API researcher. So across the bottom, you can see a timeline, and in the slightly gray boxes, you can see the emergence of different operating systems, and also when World Wide Web was introduced. So what are the emerging API technologies in this context? You see remote procedure calls, Sun being the most popular one, coming about in the 80s. This is the ability to call as if you're in a local environment, call other machines and invoke functions on other machines. You have service-oriented architecture, SOAP and REST. And then you have gRPC and GraphQL coming in kind of recently in the grand scheme of things. I think 2015 is when both of those were introduced at around the same time. And again, this is Bruno Pedro's interpretation, but what is causing the emergence of these technologies? So for RPC, this is when you first started working with the earliest versions of distributed systems, being able to call different machines, standardization, integration. In 2000, Roy Fielding's like, heck, there's too much complexity here. Let's simplify things and let's create something called REST. Now any server can talk to any other server in the world. And then again, now we have GraphQL and gRPC trying to solve issues at the data layer and control. We'll see some other benefits of gRPC, but what I hear people using gRPC for in the work setting, in the professional at scale setting, is really about control. So gRPC is Google's variant of RPC. They had an internal framework and now they've open sourced it. So now that's why we have a lovely webinar about gRPC. Besides Google, once they open sourced it, now you have a bunch of other large companies that have adopted gRPC as their preferred implementation for RPC. And if you look at some of these logos, you can see that these are companies that are operating distributed systems at scale. Nowadays, you hear about people using gRPC for native mobile app development, but really the early adopters are the ones that are operating distributed systems at scale. All right, so I'm going to really quickly introduce some gRPC concepts, but we will get tactical and hands-on with it in the next sections. So if this is going a little bit fast and this is the first time you've seen it, do not worry. So we already talked about remote procedure calls and being able to invoke functions as if it's in your local environment. However, these functions living on different machines. So now you're talking about machine-to-machine communication within a data center, across data centers. Supported method types. This is actually kind of interesting. So a lot of us that are working in HTTP or REST APIs, you're familiar with unary, or the client sends a single request and the server sends a single response in response. But now you have client streaming, where the client sending multiple messages, server streaming, and bidirectional streaming, where the client and server are sending independent messages. And all of this is using protocol buffers or protobuf. This is actually very exciting. It's language agnostic, platform agnostic. And I believe Google came up with this as well and open sourced it rather quickly after they created this encoding structure. And a proto file. So this is the schema definition of your API. Let's take a look at the proto file. So on the right there, you see an example of a baby proto file. This is how you serialize structured data. And you can see services and messages being defined in this schema definition. And you can see it's a strongly typed API, which gives us even more control. And you can use this proto file to generate client stubs and server-side code. Okay, so let's look at a diagram, because when I was learning about this and researching, how does it actually flow through? Okay, so this is an example of an order service and a payment service. And in this example, the order service is going to be our client app. The payment service is going to be our service app. So you have client and server, and you're encoding. Remember, we're using protocol buffers to encode our data. And then the transport is over HTTP2. Okay, so what's the big difference? A lot of times when I'm talking about the differences between HTTP or REST APIs and gRPC, people stick on this. gRPC is roughly 7 to 10 times faster than REST. And that piques people's interest. But again, I don't see people choosing to use gRPC because of this performance. It's just what gets their attention first. So how do gRPC APIs compare to REST? And this is thank you to Ian. Maybe we can share a link to this blog post. Ian created a great blog post. So you're considering HTTP APIs versus gRPC. And this is the TLDR. I won't go through every line here, but you can see that REST API is typically HTTP1 versus gRPC HTTP2. We talked about the communication pattern, single request, single response, versus you can add streaming now. And one of the downsides to gRPC is that a lot of the tooling doesn't support gRPC out of the box. So you're looking at using additional libraries and proxies. And so you can take a look all the way down the line, but gRPC is being used a lot because of the control, because of the language agnosticism and platform agnosticism. You can see under SDK and code generation, there's built-in code generation support, a lot of open source libraries and tools to support different use cases. Okay, so we will be sharing the slides and this recording so you can look through this at depth, but let's head on over to get tactical.
All right, thanks, Joyce. So what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to take the role as a designer, and we're basically going to design out an API. But before we do that, we're going to jump in and we're going to take a look at some tooling that Postman has. If you've used Postman for RESTful APIs, you might be familiar with Postman Echo. We actually have a gRPC version of that. And we're going to get started in this workspace. So there's an orange link on the screen. If we can get Pooja to share that in chat for us, please. This is basically going to take everyone over to a workspace where we're going to be building out this work live. And so if you want to interact, if you want to kind of watch this as we go, you'll be able to fork the collections that we do and kind of pay attention to what we're working on here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my screen here in just a moment and kind of take over the share. And I'm going to be working in the Postman desktop app, but you can use the web application version of Postman for this as well. So let me switch over to my screen. And I'll pull this up over here. All right. All right, so we're gonna basically take a look at what this Echo service is all about and how that operates. So let me close this off here to begin with. So this is basically the workspace that everyone's going to come into if you follow that link that Pooja posted, and just a little bit of documentation. There's some helpful links here that we'll share at the end of the webinar as well. But what we're going to do is we're going to show everybody how to get to that Echo service for gRPC. Now, the workflow for gRPC is a little bit different than what you might be familiar with for HTTP-based, like RESTful APIs. So we're going to start by clicking on the New button here at the top of the interface. We're going to click on the New button up here. And in the panel that comes up, we're going to choose gRPC as the icon. And then from here, what we can do is we can actually type in the host name, and it's going to be grpc.postman-echo.com. and this is the host name that we're going to connect to. And when we select the method, you'll notice that this is actually a drop-down menu. And one of the options in here is going to be to import a proto file or to use server reflection. Now, server reflection is basically a way to query the end server to say, hey, can you tell me about the RPC endpoints that you have and about the message payloads? And we're going to go in and describe what each of those are. And our Postman Echo does have server reflection turned on. This typically would not be turned on for real production systems. But as soon as I click that link, we see that it actually pulls up a list of RPC methods that we can call. So there's a say hello, lots of replies, lots of greetings, and a BD hello. Now, the icons that we see here give us an indication of 4 different types of transfer methods. The first one here looks like 1 up arrow, 1 down arrow. So the up arrow is me uploading or sending to the server, and the down arrow indicates receiving information from the server. So this first one that says say hello, we see there's 1 arrow in each direction. This is what we call a unary call. And then that basically means I'm sending 1 packet of information. I'm going to get back 1 packet of information. What it's asking us for here is the type of message that we want to compose and actually send to the server. But if I'm not familiar with this server, I may not know necessarily what to go build in here. But the nice thing about reflection is in Postman, we can use this button here that says use an example message. And as part of that reflection, it's going to say, okay, we have to send over a string in a key called greeting. Now, by default, it's going to fill this kind of stuff in with like random Latin messages. This is probably like some really clever, funny joke or something in Latin. But I'm just going to put in my name just to see what happens here. And then I can click the invoke button and unavailable. All right. Hooray for live demos. There we go. So it came back in with a reply and it says, hello, Ian. So it basically took the name that I typed in here. I can type in Joyce and send that over and it says, hello, Joyce. I can change this to Udit and I send that over and it says, hello, Udit. So we send 1 request, we get 1 response. So this is a little bit like doing a RESTful API call where we make a connection, it sends back a response, and then it kind of hangs up from there. If we look at the other RPC calls with the other icons, lots of replies. If I do the example message, it's the same outgoing message where I can put in, say, my name. But when I send this over, what we notice here in the panel is we kind of go bottom up on this. So I said, send a message here that says greeting of Ian, and it basically sent back hello, Ian, a number of times. And so this is where we send a single request. It might be, go get me a list of my favorite recipes or something like that. And it gives me back 1 message with each recipe in each message. And the nice thing about gRPC is it's kind of unpacking all of this information into these message formats that are very rigid. So it's strongly typed. So you define this as a string, this is an integer, you can get into custom data types as well. But basically we're transmitting 1 thing and receiving back a number of other messages as a response. And this is what we call a streaming response or streaming data here. The next one that we're going to try is actually streaming a bunch of messages from the client. This might be, hey, I want to send a bunch of recipes or books or, whatever, funny jokes or something like that. And I want to get back 1 response from the server letting me know that you got everything. And so that's going to be our lots of greetings here. So this one's going to operate a little bit differently. When I click on the invoke button here, which, in regular Postman, you would normally just see this as a send button. But when we click the invoke button, what we see down here in the interface is it actually indicates now that we're streaming. And so what's happening now is we're holding this connection open for a long time so that we can send multiple messages. And then when we click on the end streaming button, that indicates to the server that we're ready to get a response. And at that point, the server is going to send back 1 response and then disconnect. The nice thing about gRPC, though, is it doesn't have to disconnect at that point. We can maintain these connections because of HTTP2. We can actually keep these connections open somewhat indefinitely. And it'll reconnect. The gRPC protocol will automatically do like reestablish connections. And so the nice thing with streaming is it acts very much like a WebSocket, where we can just hold this connection open indefinitely and send a bunch of information. So in this case, for this RPC call, it's going to be me bursting a bunch of data to the server and getting one response back. And then later, maybe I send another burst of data and get one response back. So let's see what happens here. So I'm going to send over my first message with my name. So I sent over a greeting of Ian, and I'm going to send over a greeting of Joyce. I'm going to send over a greeting of Udit. And I'm just clicking on the send button on all of these, and we'll do one for Pooja as well. And then when I click on the end streaming, we'll watch what happens down here in response. It basically concatenated all of those strings together, and it sent back one response saying, hello to Ian, Joyce, Udit, and Pooja. So that's us sending a whole bunch of messages and getting one response back. And then the last one is going to be our multi-stream, which is basically both the client and the server are streaming at the same time. So I'm going to go ahead and invoke this one as well. And again, we see that it's in streaming mode. So now when I send over a greeting with my name, it's actually going to respond right away. And this is kind of the nature of streaming. It tends to work asynchronously, but you can do it in a synchronous fashion as well, where you wait for a response. But the nice thing about gRPC is it can act in both synchronous and asynchronous methods. So you can just send over a bunch of data and you will get notified when the server actually responds. So you don't have to sit and wait for the server to respond to these messages. But as I type in each of our names here and send these over, we see that the server immediately streams back a response. So we can put Udit in here, and we can put Pooja in here as well. And so this is the idea of like streaming back and forth at the same time. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into design mode in the API builder, and we're basically going to replicate this. And I'm going to show you how to build out an API. But let's do this around a theme of like sharing our favorite books. So we're going to basically design this thing from scratch. So I'm going to start over here on the left side of the interface, and I'm going to click on the APIs button. If you don't see the APIs button, you may want to click on the configure workspace sidebar down here at the bottom, and this will give you different options for what you can enable. The only ones I'm going to worry about today are APIs and environments. And actually, we don't even need environments for this. So I'm just going to keep the APIs and collections enabled here. So I'm going to go over to API mode, and I'm going to click on the link that says create an API. And it's going to ask us for a name. So I'm just going to call this like Bookshare API. Now, again, I'm just doing this from a design point of view. Imagine our governance team got together and we've kind of decided what these endpoints are going to look like and so on. And I'm basically going to come in here and design this. Now, we can start by connecting to a repository. Or down here at the very bottom, we actually see a link down here that says, I want to continue without a repository. If we synchronize with a repository, then you can actually import those proto files from there. But I'm going to continue without a repository. This is where we can start adding documentation about what we're building, and then we can get into the definition of our API here as well. There's a plus button here that we can click on to add a definition. We can also expand this over here on this side, and we can say I want to import or create a new definition file. If I click on import, we'll have the option to actually, drag and drop a file, or we can put in a curl call if we want to do that server reflection and so on. But I'm actually going to create a new definition file here. So I click on the create link, and it's going to ask us, okay, how do you want to build out this API? Some of you might be familiar with OpenAPI and Swagger, or GraphQL. We're actually going to choose protobuf 3. And the definition format can only be proto, and so it won't allow us to change that. We do have some boilerplate that you can use, but we're not going to use that today. We're actually going to take this kind of step by step and go through the different things here. So I'm going to go ahead and create that definition file. A couple things that we have to start with here. We have to tell it the syntax of what we're typing in. So we're going to say that we're using the syntax of protobuf version 3. And then we have to give this a package name. So the package name is kind of like a namespace if you're into programming. And in this case, we're just going to call it Bookshare. And then from here, we can start planning out for the service that we have. We're going to call this like book service. We basically want to plan out what our RPC methods are going to be. And so we're going to say we have an RPC method, and we're going to do one. We're going to say, I want to get a book by an ID value. which means I'm going to have to send over some kind of message. So the format that we have here looks kind of like this, where we're saying this is the payload that I'm going to send, and this is the payload that I want to have come back. Now, again, the payloads are what we call messages in gRPC, and we have to define those message formats. But for now, we're just going to kind of imagine, like, if I'm trying to fetch a book by an ID, I'm probably going to be passing an integer value. So I'm just going to say I'm going to pass this as like a book ID. And what I would expect to get back is some sort of payload that says, okay, well, maybe I've got a book with an ID value attached to it or something like that. And then what I'm going to do, just for the sake of brevity and time, is I'm going to paste in some other RPC methods for each of the other streaming types, and I'll go through and describe what each of these are going to be. So the next one that we're going to do is the example of the client streaming to the server and getting back a single response. So in this case, we're adding a parameter to inside the parentheses that has the word stream in here. And that's basically saying, for this RPC call, I'm going to be streaming multiple messages. And what I'm going to be sending is a payload that's basically, it's a book without an ID value, because if I'm transmitting data, I'm not going to be sending an ID to the server, but I'm probably going to send like the title and the author of a book. And I want to get back some kind of response. Now, this response, again, has to be predefined, but we're just saying I'm going to get back like a single response from the server. To fetch books by an author, then I'm going to have some kind of book search request where maybe I'm going to pass in a string. Maybe it's a fragment of a string. It could be a title or an author. If we just wanted to say get books by search or search books or something like that. But in this case, we want to get back at an actual stream of data, because there might be many books from the server that match that. And so we're going to get one message back for each book that matches. And then we're going to do one last call called exchange books. And this is where I'm going to stream a bunch of my favorite books. And in response, I'm going to get back a number of books from the server. So this is kind of the scope of, like, these are the endpoints that we want to go build. But again, we have to go define what these payloads are actually going to be. So we talked about sending over a book ID. So to define these payloads, we use a message keyword here, and I'm going to give it the same name here of book ID. And then we have to define what the data types and what the fields are actually going to be in here. So I'm going to pass over like a 32-bit integer maybe as my book ID. There's lots of different data types that you can choose from, but I want to send this over as a key called ID. And the interesting thing about how these protofiles work is we have to put these numeric indicators after. And this is basically saying, like, when we're transmitting or when we're parsing this data, this is the first field that we expect to get. So even though there's only one field in this message, we still have to declare that this is field number 1. And we're going to make more messages basically for each of these other types for the streaming ones. Again, just for the sake of time and brevity, I'm just going to paste this in for now, but I'll go through and explain each of these. So getting back, what we wanted to get back for getting a book by ID is we wanted to get back a payload called book with ID. And this is basically the format here that I've highlighted on the screen. Basically, we're going to expect to get back that ID value, a string of a title, and maybe the optional string of an author. So the nice thing about gRPC and the protobufs is we can specify, you know what, this field might or might not be present. If it's required, then we can put in a required keyword, but that's kind of the default for it. But we can actually specify that something is optional. So, you know, we might have a book with no author. Maybe the author's name got lost in time, or it might have multiple authors or something like that. So we're just going to say that this string is optional. For these other types, if we stream a book without an ID, this is where we're going to send information to the server. In that case, maybe all we have is a title. And again, we're going to have our author name, but that's also going to be an optional author name. And then for the, again, you know, we're going to get back books with IDs. Now, in the case of the response that we get back, this response here might just be like a single string that comes back from the server. So let's go build that here as well. So we're going to have a message called response. And we'll just say that this is going to send us back like just a string of some kind. And so we'll call this string here, and we'll say that this is going to be response. And again, we have to declare this as field number 1. So on these other ones, we've got field number 1, field number 2, field number 3. Again, these just have to be a sequential sort of pattern here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save my work. And the nice thing about this workspace, because it's public, is Udit will be able to come in and kind of continue on where we go from here. So let's take a look again at how to build our collection from here. So I'm going to click on the collections now that we've got our proto file made. And what I'm going to do again, I'm going to click on the new button up here at the top. I'm not going to create a collection from here. By default, this will create an HTTP like RESTful based collection. But we're going to click on the new button up here at the top again. We're going to select gRPC. And from here, we don't really have a server built yet. And so we can't really choose anything from here. But in the dropdown for the RPC call, what we can do is we can say, I want to import a proto file. And what we'll have the ability to do here, not the import, is actually want to use a definition that we've already got. So I want to go back on this one. And so what I can do here is in this dropdown is it'll actually go take a look at all of the APIs that we have in the workspace. In this case, it finds our Bookshare API. And I've got a syntax error, so we can go in and we'll fix that. And let's see, what did I miss here? So it was a problem on line number 1. Oh, sorry, syntax equals proto3. So we'll go fix that. And we'll come back over here and we're going to reload that. It reloaded okay. And now we'll actually see in the dropdown, it's actually got all of those endpoints that we made. So get book by ID, send books, and so on. So if I click on get book by ID, now we might be able to invoke this. But again, we don't have a server built. We haven't actually designed any of the software. But the nice thing about Postman, if you're familiar with Postman, is we have the ability to create a mock server. But the neat thing that the team has built at Postman is as soon as you build that proto file, we actually automatically launch a mock server for you. And so there's actually a mock server ready to go here. And so we can put in that URL and we can go to the invoke. And just by having that proto file, we actually have a mock server where it's going to take a look at the message payload with the data types, and it's just going to randomly give us some data back here. And so it saw, well, you wanted an int 32, so it technically gave us, a 32-bit integer, but in this case, a negative value doesn't really make sense. And we can also see that the title and the author get filled in, but these are random sort of Latin-based strings. If we look at the metadata here, this is kind of analogous to the headers that you might see in an HTTP request. And one of the things that we see here is this seed, and this is just a random seed number that if we send this in our own metadata, then we're always going to get back that exact same response. Right now, if I invoke this over and over again, we'll see that the number changes and those Latin strings change. But if I go to the metadata here and I see that seed value, I'm going to grab the seed value here and we'll go back to the response. If I add that as my own metadata here, and this is just for the sake of the mock server here at Postman, if I pass in that seed value and send that over, we're always going to get back that exact same thing. So it's basically the random seed, the random number generator seed, and it's always going to give us that same thing back. So if you want to write some testing, that would be really helpful, that you know that the server is always going to give you back a specific message. Now we could go through and we could do like each of these things, and that would basically just repeat what we did earlier with the Postman Echo. But again, we can use the example message button here to say, if I want to send multiple books, what would that need to look like? I can click on send, use example message. It says, okay, we need an author and we need a title. So this could be my author name, and then this could be my book title. And when I send this over, then I can send that and I can end the streaming, and then we get that single string response coming back. Now, again, it's just randomized based on the mock server. So the way that the Postman mock server will work for gRPC right now is that it's always going to randomize these strings. Unlike the RESTful mock servers or the gRPC or the GraphQL mock servers, where you can save an example and then recall those saved static files. The gRPC one right now will always randomize those strings and send those back instead of any saved examples that you make. If we were to save the response that we have here, there is the ability to save that as an example. That would basically be used for documentation purposes. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to save this. I'm going to call this request get book by ID. And from here, now we can create our collection, and we'll call this our Bookshare API. Again, the workflow for gRPC is slightly different, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to create that collection and we're going to save that response. We're going to come back up here and we're going to change this back to get book by ID. I'm going to take off that seed value. Going to invoke it with the mock server just to make sure that that still works, and it does. So we're going to go ahead and save that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it over to Udit to work through some testing. And while he's doing that, I'm actually going to build out the other 4 endpoints that, or the other 3 endpoints that we need. So we have a complete collection here. And again, if you want to use the URL that Pooja pasted in chat earlier, then you'll be able to come in and see all of this work as well. So Udit, I'll hand it over to you to continue with the testing.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. So yeah, I think one thing which I noticed in the chat is like we have to also publish the API. So maybe we can do that later so everyone can have access to this protobuf. But yeah, since I'm part of the same workspace, I can actually access the protofile which Ian, or we can say, let's say an API designer in your team has authored and designed and tested using a Postman mock server. So we already have a collection for it. Now, assuming as a developer, I have the working server ready. So what I can do is like actually I start changing the URL from a mock server to, let's say, a locally running server. It could be like an environment variable, which could be a production or a stage URL as well. So let's see if it works. Okay. Yes. Let me actually retry by creating a new gRPC call. I have my local server. I will use the same API. Okay. Cool. Okay. So what I did here is I used the same protobuf API, which Ian just authored. And I'm using the getBookById method. And I have this CSV build, which is returning, or let's say any database from where all these books are fetched from an ID. So a book with ID of 3 or 4, right? So this is a very simple server which we have created. So I can actually start now testing these, right? So one thing, let me just quickly talk about the interface of gRPC. So like HTTP, these gRPC APIs can be protected using some authorization scheme. So you can set those if in a production environment or based on the requirement. Just like headers, metadata is like any meta information needed for that API. And you might be familiar with test and pre-request script in Postman. In gRPC, there's a scripts tab and which has a before invoke, which is like a pre-request in HTTP, and a after response, which is like a test script, right? So the idea is like before invoking a method, a before invoke script is executed, and once you have the response, and after response script is executed. So now to add any test, what we have here is a bunch of snippets which you can use to get started really quick. So let's use one of these. So it says to test for if the response has a status code of 0. So you might be familiar with a status code of 200 from an HTTP indicating a successful response or a 2xx response. But in gRPC, the status code are from 0 to 16. A 0 here signifies a successful response, as you can see here. So I added a test for it, and once we invoke it, we see that test pass, that the status code is indeed 0. We can actually try breaking this. For example, if I pass in an invalid ID, we see the status code is 2 unknown and the test result failed. So let me switch back. Okay. Similarly, we can have a few familiar tests which we usually do in our REST APIs. Let's say a response time should be under 200 milliseconds. So yeah, I feel good about this API right now. So what I can do is I can actually just save it into a new collection. For example, we'll call it share API. This is get book by ID, right? So now this Ian or anyone in the team can actually go and test this API. But let's say not everyone have access to my local server, right? So what we can do is we can actually save an example of a response. so that even if you cannot invoke an API, you can still refer to an example which is saved along with this request. So you can save an example by just clicking on this button, which will save, let's say, it is a 0 okay response. So now without even invoking the request, one can just see that a payload like this with get book ID method responds with this API. And the good thing about the example is we can save all the successful as well as some the various scenarios. In this case, that's an unsuccessful response, right? At to unknown. So we can actually save this as an example too. We can say this is a unknown response. So my team member can just know that this method, how it behaves with various responses. So let's create and test other methods as well. So I will use the same local server, use the same API, and at this time, let's use the streaming call, which is to send books, right? So Ian already talked about how we can use this to generate a random payload, but let's say we can also use environment variables here. What I really like using in these testing scenarios is the random variables. So to get an author name, I can just use a random full name. The title can be like a random catchphrase. So we can see the server is now connected and just waiting for me to send a first message. So I can send a bunch of messages. You can see it is generating random names and titles here. And once I'm done with after sending all the messages, I can end the stream and we see that the response is received, which is just the concatenation of all the ebooks I have uploaded. Now to test the streaming methods, it's very similar. Obviously, we can test for if the status code is 200. But one thing which I like to do for streaming or a message in protobuf, which is of a similar pattern, is to have a JSON schema test for it. So the idea is I want to make sure all the messages which I send complies to a certain JSON schema. So we know we can test the response, but we can also test the request, which is the messages we have sent. So pm.request here we can use to access all the messages, and we can say that all the messages should comply to a JSON schema. Let's look over to the schema. So we see that all the outgoing messages have a property author. So let's say the author, which is of type string, and we can have something like, say, it should have a max length of 10. So if anything which is more than 10 characters as in author name, the test will fail. So let me actually change it to a lower value and see if that works. So invoke and end the stream. Okay. So I think it has a valid name here. Okay. So actually I changed. The author should be the property here. The type is string, and this is X length of 5. And I'm testing the request. So I actually, instead of changing the property, I changed the type to author, which is incorrect. But the idea is you can put in any JSON schema here to test it. So let's invoke and test again, and send, and we see that the test result failed because one of the author name is more than 5 characters. So this helps us to bulk test on multiple messages so that we don't have to actually test each message one by one. So similarly, let's save this example. We can call it send books. Okay, and now let's test the other methods which we have with this API. Let's see what we have. So we have get books by author. Okay, let me I'll again use my local server here and see how this works. So this is expecting an author name and will respond. It is a server stream, which means the server will respond with multiple messages. So I asked for all the books from J.K. Rowling, and as we can see that the server has responded with multiple books from this author. Now, to test this, again, we have pm.response here. So let's actually see what pm.response actually is. So we can actually log this into Postman console and see what does pm.response actually exist. So it is a JSON object, JavaScript object, which has all the response properties. One of which we are interested right now is messages. So these are all the messages which we got here. So you can write a test on this. One test which I, let's say, am willing to test here is that an author should have at least 3 books or a maximum of 3 books, something like that. So let's write a test for that. Now, chai.js tests in JavaScript, if you are familiar with it, what we can do is we can say have at least 3 books. So now this pm.expect is the chai syntax which I'm talking about. So what we can do is we can say pm.response.messages, which has a property of count to be greater than 3. So what this is testing here is that once I invoke this method, the responses should consist of or the author should have at least 3 books published in the database. So let's see. Invoke, and the test result does indeed pass because we got 7 results here. So just to verify, we can actually change this to 30. Invoke again. We're getting the response, and the test result failed because it doesn't meet threshold. Okay. So yeah. So initially we saved an example of a unary message, but we can also save an example of a streaming message with a similar fashion. We can save an example of a successful response. Here we can configure all these responses as we like. We can actually change the type. We can change how we want to convey a scenario here. And just like that, we can actually test all the different types of methods gRPC have, the unary and the streaming ones have the examples ready for it. And the good thing about example is once you have it there, it auto generates a documentation for you. So this is from here, you can actually see a documentation and you can directly already see that a method getBook by ID expects this field returns a book with ID, which Ian authored. A successful response looks like this. An unsuccessful response looks like this. So as you author your collection, your documentation is automatically created for all the scenarios as you build your collection. So yeah, Ian, I think we are good here. We can use this collection and switch the variable in URL with an invariable of a production server or a stage server as we like.
Awesome. Cool. And we'll start to wrap up from here. So thanks, Udit, for walking us through the testing. Actually, I've got a quick question for Udit. So when you were doing the JSON schema where you're checking, we have these fields and so on, is that actually necessary with gRPC? Because with gRPC, with protobufs, if we try to send something to the server that doesn't strictly conform to that message payload, we're just going to get an error back. So is it actually necessary to do like strict JSON schema testing with gRPC?
It's not necessarily required, but the idea with JSON schema is you can have a complex schema which can test for example. I tested for a max length, right? Which you cannot do with the protobuf. The protobuf can only test for if it is a string. But you can say it is a max length or it is an enum of certain things, right? So you can actually have a much more complex schema and like save a lot of time if you want to, let's say, test a bunch of messages with let's say a similar character.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Joyce, can we go on to the next slide, please? So this is something new that we've published. It's called Postman Academy. And we've actually got a very helpful kind of step-by-step walkthrough that you can do with gRPC. So for those who are new to gRPC, this will kind of go back and reiterate some of the history that Joyce shared, and also how to get started, how to use the slightly different workflow for working with gRPC that we demonstrated. And so you can just go to academy.postman.com/gRPC and Postman, separated by dashes. And it'll basically take you through a whole walkthrough, step-by-step kind of guide for working with gRPC inside of Postman. I think from there, we'll go on to our additional resources slide. So we've got more Intergalactics coming up. Pooja's got a great one planned out for October. So again, you can come back and register for these. They are free. They all do get recorded. And just by registering, you'll get an email from Zoom with the recording afterwards. We've also got lots of quick starts that you can go take a look at as well. Our community forum is a great place to come and hang out and ask lots of questions. So if you want to interact with the team and ask lots of questions about gRPC, we've got a handful of questions that we'll get to. Some frequently asked questions that I had at gRPC conference last week, we're seeing come up in the Q&A panel here. So we want to make sure that we've got some time to go through these. It'll have to go kind of quickly. We've only got about 5 minutes left here. So we do have a survey. Pooja, if you could drop this link in chat for us, please. We would really, really appreciate it if everybody could fill out the survey for us as well. This helps, again, for telling us, like, how did we do on the session? What can we do differently? What other kind of content would you like to see? And so we really appreciate everybody's time if you can fill out the survey for us while we do the Q&A here. So a couple of frequently asked questions that we get. One that we answered a whole bunch is, can we get a copy of the server? Can we get a copy of the proto file that we worked in today? The API is published, so if you go to the workspace that we posted in chat, you'll be able to see the proto file that we built. There are a lot of open source tools from Google, for example, where you can take that proto file and start to build out your own server-side code as well as client-side code if you want. But I will publish the Python server that Udit showed. I will get that open sourced at some point in the very near future, probably before the YouTube recording goes live. And so we'll make sure that it's also linked in the YouTube description. So come back and go subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/postman. And when you see that video go live, I'll make sure that the open source link is in there for you. A couple of other questions that we had come in as well for frequently asked questions is, can we use gRPC with the command line tools like Postman, CLI, and Newman? Right now, we don't support that. I think the team might be working towards that. Udit, can you talk a little bit about the command line support for gRPC?
Yeah, so command line support means you are executing a collection run, right? And right now, the gRPC collections cannot be executed. So this is something which we are working on to have an ability to execute a collection with gRPC requests. So once we have it, adding support for command line should be fast enough. This is on the roadmap, but no ETA just yet.
Okay. Another question that we had is, right now, the test that you were showing is when we're doing streaming and we're getting streamed responses back from the server, none of the test code, like the test code that runs after the request finishes, none of that gets executed until we actually close the stream. What would we need to do from Postman's perspective to allow testing for messages as they come in, as opposed to waiting until we close the stream? Is that something that's actually technically possible?
Right. Yeah. So right now we have two types of script. If you are familiar with HTTP, we have a pre-request and a test script. Test script is like a post-response script, right? So similarly, we have an after-response script. So the script is executed only after you get the response. And in streaming call, you get a response when the stream is ended. So that is why right now you have to actually end the stream in case of a bidirectional or a client streaming case. But the idea is like this is only executed at the end of your session or a call. But having an ability to execute a script on each message, let's say execute a script on each incoming message, is something we get a feature request on GitHub all the time. So I would like let's say anyone who is having this requirement to go and talk about their use case, and we'll definitely are actually working to introduce a script similar to it, where it is executed on each message, because we do realize for a full automation workflow, this is something very common. But yeah, it's not supported right now.
Okay. Let's see. Just looking through some of the other questions that our team saved for us to answer. Because yeah, we had a lot of questions about the collection runner, CLI tools, and so on. If I clone a Git repository to Postman, so this one came in anonymous. If I clone a Git repository to Postman and go to the project, why can only HTTP requests be created? If the collection has gRPC requests and I want to add those, can't those be added? So again, we are working to sort of update the UI to allow for that. It's not ready yet. We can't really give a timeline for it, but we are working on the UI so that it will be a little bit easier to work with both HTTP and sort of what, the other alternative API types like WebSockets and gRPC. So that will be coming at some point down the road yet. Another question that I got at the gRPC conference is right now the mock server only returns randomized responses, and it's the same random response in the case of streaming. So one question is, could the random responses sort of cycle if there is a streamed response? And then the other one is, if we make a saved example, would it be possible to send that back instead of the randomized string?
Yeah.
Udit, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So right now, as we saw, right, the mock server is actually powered from the protobuf. So it is mocking a protobuf API and doesn't really know about a collection or a saved examples. However, if you are coming from, let's say, our HTTP support or the mocks for REST APIs, it is a scenario-based mocks from your collection. Again, this is something which is not supported yet. We are gradually and incrementally adding support for to have all the protocols at the same feature set as we do in HTTP. This is again on the roadmap, and I will highly recommend everyone to just go on GitHub and +1 and file your feature request, because that is the only way we actually prioritize and the only way you can fast track your use case with mocks or Postman CLI.
Great. Awesome. Well, we're out of time. We did have a couple of questions left over, but we want to be respectful of everybody's time. So please, if you would, go over to our community forum. If you've got additional questions, we'd love to interact with you over there. I pasted the link in the Zoom chat. Again, it's just community.postman.com. Joyce, thank you for the introduction to gRPC and all the work that you did on the research and kind of giving us the history on gRPC. I actually learned some stuff about all of the history of it that I hadn't actually known before.
Something.
Yeah, today I learned.
I do want to give a shout out for next month's Intergalactic. We have a session on the VS Code extension. People are very excited about that, and registration is open. So check that out.
Yep, definitely go check that out. Joyce, thanks again for your work, and Udit, thank you to you and your team for all the work that you put into to giving us gRPC support inside of Postman. We're super excited to continue to play with it and continue to see the innovation from your team. So thank you again for your time. Thank you to everybody who attended today. We'll wrap up from here, and again, you'll get an email from Zoom right away with the recording, and we'll get this up on YouTube very soon. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you next month at Intergalactic.